You bring all these people up, but it's insane. I mean, Jesus is completely unparalleled, completely different than all these rest.
You are a Christian. You've always been a Christian. Of course you think that Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And so I understand
You've almost said that you think Jesus is the most compassionate, the most influential, amazing person. You've said
I don't think he's
close to
compassionate.
that.
No, I don't. But so you're in the Christian tradition and you want to show that you're right. And, and so, okay.
I want to just demonstrate that Jesus is Lord because
doing this as a historian.
Died for our sins, and I want people to know that.
Exactly. You're a theologian, and that's fine. I have no qualms with you as a theologian. What I have qualms with is you claiming that you're doing this on disinterested historical ground.
It's a historical religion. If it didn't happen in history, it didn't happen.
But if you're going to be a historian, you have to treat every religion equally,
and
not giving superiority to your particular faith.
But if you're going to be a historian...
You asked me why I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics. And I don't think
he can feed things into his system, for sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Feeding things into his system to bring a dead person to life is not the same thing as making 2 + 2 5. That's completely different things.
They are both laws that have never been broken in history.
Except in the case of Jesus, right?
But is the historical issue here then that you think that this claim that the Messiah had been raised was kind of a post facto kind of sort of rationalization of these experiences they had?
They thought he was the Messiah before he died, in my judgment.
Right, so they did think he was the Messiah.
They weren't expecting him to die.
Right.
He died. One of them, 2 of them, 3 of them said, I've seen the Lord. And then they had to figure out, well, how does that work? And it must mean, if he's alive again, it must mean that God's raised him from the dead.
But there were other...
These are apocalyptic Jews. Apocalyptic Jews, the only way they can imagine life after death is an embodied existence. They don't believe the soul lives on after death. These are Jews. Jews believe that the body and soul are one thing, and that afterlife, if there is an afterlife, it's body and soul. That if they see Jesus alive afterwards, it must mean that his soul has come back into his body. How does that happen? It can only happen when God does it.
Okay.
God has raised him from the dead. Once they say they raised him from the dead and they already knew he was the Messiah, that's when they start saying the Messiah was raised.
Quick response and we'll go to a break and then we'll carry on.
I was just going to say, but there's other categories that they could have, as Jews, thought of. The Maccabees died horrible deaths, and they believed they lived on, exalted in the heaven. And they, you have many other examples of this kind of disembodied continuing to live on, but they will rise again at the final resurrection. But what the early Christians said is that Jesus had risen again now. The resurrection had already begun. Bart agrees with that. But where did that idea come from? That's the unexpectedness.
Yeah, it came from
completely unexpected. Right. But you're saying they put it together. You're saying they're the geniuses who put this innovative, unparalleled idea that has changed the world. That all goes back to the brain of Mary Magdalene?
I'm changing the world has nothing to do with it. The issue is, what does an apocalyptic Jew...
It did change the world, though, right?
What does an apocalyptic Jew think if they see somebody who had died, who's alive now? Now, when you see your grandmother in your bedroom 2 weeks after she died, typically today, this happens a lot, 1 out of 8 people in our country have a vision of a deceased loved one and are convinced they're alive again or that they're alive. In our context, we believe that the body and the soul are separable, and the soul lives on afterwards. So when you see your grandmother in your bedroom, as 1 out of 8 people, not necessarily your grandmother, but some beloved one, typically what you think is their soul's gone to heaven, they've come down to visit me, because that's our mentality of an afterlife.
But
apocalypticists don't have that. They don't have that view. Their view is that if somebody's alive after they died, it has to be a resurrection because the soul doesn't exist outside the body. So when they see Jesus, he's got to have a soul back in the body, which means God has raised him from the dead. That's the first thing they know, and they don't have any theology about it. It's just, oh my God, he's come back from the dead, and then they work it out.
Quick response, and we'll go to our break.
No, Josephus, for example, definitely believes souls exist.
He's not an
outside.
Apocalyptic Jew.
Well, why not?
He's anti-apocalyptic. I don't know if you've studied Josephus. Josephus is famously anti-apocalyptic. We're talking about apocalyptic Jews.
Bart assumes that they just saw something, but he hasn't explained to us what they saw. And whatever they saw changed their complete worldview.
I don't know what you see when you see your grandmother either.
Okay, but I definitely don't say she's raised from the dead.
You say she's still alive.
Well, but she's still dead though, right?
In Jesus' case, my point is...
in our case, if you're going to use that parallel, in our case, when we see someone in the afterlife, yes, we think they're still alive in heaven, but we say they're dead here on earth.
We say their body is dead.
That's not what the early Christians said.
That's right.
They said Jesus had risen from the dead.
Right. So you need to listen.
A crucified man had risen from the dead.
Yes, you need to listen to why that is. We say their body is dead and their soul is alive because we believe in the difference between the body and the soul. Apocalyptic Jews did not. They could not say that his soul is still living because his body can't be alive unless his soul comes back into it. They don't have our view of the separation of body.
I disagree with you.
Well, look, we're going to take a break there.
Really?
We're going to take a break.
Okay, tell me some.
When a few early followers said they saw Jesus after his death, that alone doesn't prove a resurrection. Psychological studies show that grief hallucinations are incredibly common. About 13% of bereaved people report vivid visions of deceased loved ones. These aren't random. They're often shaped by cultural expectations. And for apocalyptic Jews, the group Jesus and his followers belong to, resurrection didn't mean a ghost or a soul in heaven. It meant bodily revival. Their worldview didn't support the idea of a disembodied soul living on. So if someone thought they saw Jesus, they interpreted it as a physical resurrection. Not because it happened, but because they had no other framework for understanding that experience. This isn't speculation. Jewish texts like the Book of Daniel show their belief in a future bodily resurrection, not some eternal spirit world. And when Paul writes decades later, even he never describes seeing a physical Jesus, only a revelation or vision. That suggests the original resurrection claim likely started with grief-induced visions, not an empty tomb.
Just add, Bart says this is happening all the time. Where does someone project an enemy apparition? What example
it
do you
happens
have?
sometimes. If you feel guilty, for example, if you feel guilty about what you've done to somebody leading to...
Give me an example.
Well, if you read the psychological literature on visions, you actually find a good bit of it.
Anything specific?
Well, they aren't names that you would... They're just people. They're just people,
Pretty sure. Not in the literature. Not in the literature. No.
Okay, well, I suggest you read it.
There is no projection of enemies in the literature. Dale Allison would
yeah. So what I'd say is that some people have hypothesized that Paul felt very guilty, or that Peter felt very guilty about his denial of Jesus, and that he started out, and so because of his guilt, he saw something. It's very common. One of the most common reasons for seeing a bereaved loved one is because you felt like you mistreated them before they died, and the guilt creates and so.
But again, that doesn't guarantee saying an unparalleled claim of resurrection of a Messiah that was crucified. He could have felt like he forgave him, but it doesn't mean he would have said that.
And not only that, but I've never said it did. And so that isn't my claim.
You said that's what caused Peter's claim.
Peter did not...
He didn't claim Jesus rose from the dead?
Okay. What I've been saying is Peter did not claim that the Messiah got raised from the dead the second he saw Jesus. What he thought was Jesus had come back to life.
You're saying he figured it out as an apocalyptic Jew. I'm going with your argument, yeah. But Paul, how does Paul imagine
I was getting to that.
Crucified man
I was getting to that.
Rising from the dead that he hates, that he thinks cursed by God, appearing to him? I'm looking forward to that one.
Okay, go ahead, Bart.
So Paul did not get this information from Peter and James. Paul was persecuting Christians before he ever met Peter and James. So he knows the Christian claims already. There have been a lot of psychological analyses about what might have happened to somebody who feels guilt over what they're doing to these people that would generate a vision and to have a conversion. As you probably know, there are instances in which people who are enemies of Christ have visions in which they get converted. And so Paul would be in that category.
Yeah. Okay. But again, Sundar Singh, by the way, would be a great example of this. This was an Indian that became a great missionary. He was burning Bibles. He was persecuting Christians in the early 1900s, and ultimately he had a vision of Jesus, and he was transformed like Paul. But again, that happened after the Christian claim has already been made.
Yes, so did Paul. So did Paul.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's exactly the same. So you can't say that it doesn't happen to enemies.
So you think he understood...
Because you just gave the example of an enemy where it happened.
So you think he understood the Christian claim clearly as he was persecuted?
He understood that they were saying Jesus got raised from the dead, absolutely. Okay. And then why else is he persecuted?
And then he imagined on the Damascus Road...
I didn't say he imagined anything on the Damascus Road.
Well, what happened on the Damascus Road?
I just said that there are lots of options, and we don't know because he doesn't tell us.
Okay. Well, he said he saw the Lord Jesus. That's what he said.
He said he saw the Lord Jesus. But what where did he see him? When did he see him? How did he see him? How close was him? Did they talk? Did they spend a week together?
Seeing him's good enough, right?
He thought he saw Jesus. I've been saying that all along. He thought he saw Jesus.
I'm not expecting.
I'm asking why you don't believe him. Why do you think Paul's wrong?
Why don't I think a person got raised from the dead?
Yes.
Oh.
Why don't you think Jesus got raised from the dead?
I don't think anybody gets raised from the dead. Okay. Because it violates the laws of nature.
Okay.
I mean,
so you have the kind of a materialist, fundamentalist view.
Well, let me ask this. You think God raised Jesus from the dead, right? Do you think God can break the laws of mathematics? Can God
can't contradict himself, no. Because he is...
Exactly.
Mathematics is his language.
That's right. The other language he uses is physics. Can he break the laws of physics?
I mean, I think we're getting off.
No, we are not getting off. This is precisely... You asked me why I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics.
And I don't think God... He can feed things into his system, for sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Feeding things into his system to bring a dead person to life is not the same thing as making 2 + 2 5. That's completely different things.
They are both laws that have never been broken in history.
Except in the case of Jesus, right?
So here's the question. This is it's a very big question, because what you're arguing is that the most probable event that happens with Jesus, because Paul and Peter said it happened, the most probable thing is the violation of a law of physics that has never been violated in 13.8 billion years. Never. Except in this one instance. Well, now, if you're a historian, historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence to
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
not just
so?
that. Not just that.
When someone says, Paul saw Jesus, and that proves the resurrection, they're missing a critical point. Paul himself never describes seeing a physical Jesus. He only reports a vision. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists Jesus appearing to people, including himself, but never says it was a body anyone could touch. And let's be clear, Paul wasn't a neutral witness. He already knew the resurrection claim, so his experience, whatever it was, came after the idea was already spreading. Visions like this are well documented. People under intense guilt, stress, or trauma often experience vivid hallucinations, especially during radical life shifts. A 2019 meta-study on religious visions showed that many so-called divine encounters happen in similar psychological states. Bart's point isn't just theory. It's supported by research in bereavement psychology, where guilt and grief often lead to mental projections of lost or even resented figures. The Christian apologist's example of Sundar Singh, someone who also had a vision and converted, doesn't help their case. It actually proves Bart's. Emotional trauma can produce powerful religious experiences that feel real, but aren't evidence of a supernatural event. And Bart nails it. If you're claiming the only time in history that the laws of physics were broken was in one unverified event 2,000 years ago based on a vision, you're not doing history. You're asking for blind faith. And historians don't work that way.
We're just getting started.
What's interesting here for me, Bart, though, is that presumably, on the face of it, if you do believe that God would never, if there is a God, let's say, that God would never break the laws of physics, then on the faces of it, no amount of evidence could persuade you of a miraculous claim. You've kind of decided that before you come to the text.
What you'd have to do is you'd have to have evidence from physicists that these laws don't apply.
Okay, so you'd have to go to the physicist rather than the historian.
You certainly can prove it, because physicists...
So we need to go to the physicists for the evidence.
Well, if you're going to say that the laws of physics have been broken one time in the history of the human race, then you need pretty good evidence. And the evidence that somebody said they saw somebody...
But that's not the only evidence, and we're going to talk about more. But that's not the only evidence. We were talking about the appearances, and the appearances, I think, and you've said this, and I've appreciated you said this in how Jesus became God. You talk about how basically the evidence is consistent with if Jesus did rise from the dead. And I appreciate that, because you're saying if Jesus rose from the dead, basically the evidence we have looks the same. It would look the same. So you don't believe he rose from the dead, but the evidence does support the miracle. Do you agree with that?
No, of course I don't.
Well, okay, consistent with the miracle.
Let me.
Is it consistent with the miracle?
Let me put it this way. There is a famous Jewish holy man, Baal Shem Tov, who eyewitnesses have told us, lived in the 18th century. He told us he could heal the sick, he could cast out demons, he could raise the dead. We have eyewitness accounts of this. And my suspicion is that you don't think it really happened, because you'd be suspicious of those reports.
I think the fact that nobody outside of Hasidic Jews think it happened is quite
okay. Who outside of Christians think that Jesus was raised from the dead?
Pinchas Lapid. He was a Jewish historian and scholar. He wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus. You should read it. It's actually really good. He actually was convinced by the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. Okay.
You should read it. It's really
I mean,
good.
I guess the point is, if you come to believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead physically, it's quite likely you will become a Christian. So
if you believe the miracles of Baal Shem Tov, then you become a Hasidic Jew.
And I also point out
so that is an evidence that Baal Shem Tov really did these things, because somebody believes and then converts. It's not evidence.
And I would also add that there are scholars that I appreciate, people like E.P. Sanders. I know you respect E.P. Sanders. Like in Jesus and Judaism, the way he ends is basically saying, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But he admits the evidence is pretty strong. There's people that admit the evidence is strong, but they still don't go all the way.
I guess my question is...
I think the evidence, though, is strong. I don't think that's...
You haven't cited any convincing... All you've cited so far are eyewitnesses.
I mean...
And you've agreed that eyewitnesses in other cases don't work for you, including Baal Shem Tov. And so I'd like to know, why do you choose some eyewitnesses over others?
Again, nobody... This goes back to Moroni. Nobody outside of those few people believed Moroni appeared to them. Nobody outside of certain Hasidic Jews believed that Baal Shem Tov did miracles.
How about Mormons?
How about Christians?
How about Mormons?
I just said nobody believes those miraculous claims happen outside.
Yes, well, nobody outside of the Christian faith thinks that Jesus is the Son of God who was raised from the dead.
No. But people like Paul, for example, is an enemy that got convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Who is the Paul for Baal Shem Tov? Tell me who he is.
Well, there are a lot of Hasidic Jews who didn't start out as Hasidic Jews who read these stories and become convinced.
But who's a Paul? Who's someone who was persecuting the Hasidic Jews and then got convinced by the Baal Shem Tov miracles? You bring all these people up, but it's insane. I mean, Jesus is completely unparalleled, completely different than all these rest.
You are a Christian. You've always been a Christian. Of course you think that Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And so I understand
almost said that you think Jesus is the most compassionate, the most influential, amazing person. You said
I don't
that
think
he's close to that.
No, I don't know. But so you're in the Christian tradition and you want to show that you're right. And, so, okay.
I want to just demonstrate that Jesus is Lord because he
as a historian.
died for our sins, and I want people to know that.
Exactly. Yeah. You're a theologian, and that's fine. I have no qualms with you as a theologian. What I have qualms with is you claiming that you're doing this on disinterested historical ground.
It's a historical religion. If it didn't happen in history, it didn't happen.
But if you're going to be a historian, you have to treat every religion equally, and not giving superiority to your particular faith.
But if you're going to be a historian, you need to be open-minded to miracles.
Yes, you're open-minded to everything.
No,
I am open-minded, yes. If you can show...
you said that the physics can't be...
I did say that.
Defied.
No. You didn't hear me.
Okay.
I said, you're saying it happened once in the entire human race. How many people have lived? I don't know how many people have lived on, billions of people. Mm-hmm. There are 8 billion people alive today. None of them is going to rise from the dead. How many people have risen from the dead? In your judgment, 1 out of, 20 billion who've lived or something. How many people have mistaken something they've seen? How many people have had a dream that they thought was something that was real? How many people have had a vision of a deceased loved one afterwards? Millions.
Right.
I mean, this is basically Hume's argument, isn't it? Against miracles. That essentially
so I'm different from Hume. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying that if you're...
So you're saying a historian can discover miracles in history then? You are saying that?
I wish you wouldn't put words in my lips.
Okay. Because I said you seem to be closed-minded as a historian on miracles.
Let me repeat it because I don't think you heard it. I'm saying that historians establish what probably happened on the past on the basis of probabilities. If the probability is 1 out of 800 billion or something versus 1 out of 8, what do historians think about that? Do they think it's more likely that the laws of physics are broken? Even they grant, laws of physics, suppose they grant that. Do they say it did happen in this one instance because we have these 3 people who said it happened? Or do they say maybe they missaw something?
Okay. Justin, and then we'll move on to your next bedrock fact.
We talked about, 107 billion people, that have walked the planet. That's fine. Out of those 107 billion people, how many of those people, those human beings, are worshipped by billions of people and called Lord and God today?
I don't know what the number is.
One.
So 107 billion. So how many? How many of those have been?
Let me finish my. Please let me finish my point. No. This is my turn.
Okay.
I'll
let you respond.
I thought you wanted me to respond to that.
Jesus is the only.
You asked me a question.
Okay.
You asked me a question. You wanted to know how many, and I was trying to answer your question. So may I answer your question?
Tell me someone else other than Jesus that's worshipped by billions.
I'm answering by asking you.
Oh no! See, that's not. You weren't answering the question.
Okay, I will answer the question.
So let me at least finish my point.
107 billion. You can't say that more people worship Jesus now, therefore he was raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because let me finish.
Let me finish my point. I was making a point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question, and I'm answering it now. Let me finish my question.
And then you come back.
You say 107 billion, and since more people worship Jesus now, that's evidence.
No, that's not what I said.
Okay, then I
so let me finish.
Okay.
So I'm saying what we have here is an extraordinary, by exactly these exact odds that you're talking about, we have an extraordinary anomaly. We have one human being who walked this earth from the last, billions of years, and however long humans have been on the earth. Out of 107 billion, this one human being is worshipped by billions and called Lord and God. I'm saying that is an extraordinary anomaly. And so I'm saying that's something that historians would go, wow, that kind of is amazing. If Jesus achieved that extraordinary anomaly, 1 out of 107 billion on that point, maybe he achieved another extraordinary anomaly. Maybe he rose from the dead.
Okay. Are you really using that as a historical argument?
I'm using it as an argument for the resurrection, whatever you want to call it.
What kind of argument would you call it?
Well, what's your problem with the argument?
But isn't it an extraordinary anomaly that Jesus is worshipped by billions? How is a crucified man...
No, it's not an anomaly at all. I wrote an entire book explaining how it happened.
Okay, how does a crucified man in his mid-30s, how is he worshipped by billions of people today? I mean, you don't think that's not an extraordinary anomaly?
It's not an anomaly. It's amazing.
By definition, mathematics, 1 out of 107 billion. But I'll let you finish.
Why is that proof that he was raised from the dead? It's proof that people are convinced he was raised from the dead.
I said it's a good argument against this idea that you were making that, you're telling me only one person out of all the 107 billion rose from the dead? A historian can't say that. That's not good enough evidence. Well, here's another point on that same person that is an extraordinary anomaly.
But you can't explain that one. You can explain why there are so many billions of Christians in the world. It's not hard to explain, without a miraculous explanation. So why? I don't understand why you're arguing this.
But this single individual has had this kind of impact.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
So it's normal for crucified men in the ancient world that are Jews to be worshipped by billions and lay the foundations of Western civilization. This is normal.
You are not listening.
As Justin Bass grew frustrated and emotional, Bart Ehrman stayed grounded, calmly pointing out what actual historians rely on: evidence, not popularity or faith. Christianity's growth doesn't prove resurrection any more than Islam's global expansion proves Muhammad split the moon. Religious influence isn't rare. It's predictable. Sociologists and historians like Rodney Stark have shown that Christianity's rise was helped by social networks, Roman infrastructure, and centuries of political backing. Not a miracle. In fact, mass belief in supernatural events happens across all major religions and cults, from Hindu milk-drinking statues to Marian apparitions. None of those are treated as historical facts, and neither should Jesus' resurrection. Bart also nailed the core problem. No credible historian would say a one-time violation of natural law is more probable than people being mistaken, especially when visions, hallucinations, and false memories are well documented in grief psychology. Studies show up to 60% of grieving people experience vivid visions of the deceased. That's not rare. What's rare is building a theology on it. So the real question is, do we rewrite physics for one ancient claim backed by a few biased followers? Or do we accept the far more likely explanation that stories evolved, beliefs spread, and people were wrong? What's more dangerous? Believing something because it feels good, or questioning it because it doesn't make sense? Let us know in the comments. Like if this gave you something to think about, and subscribe for more evidence-based breakdowns.
Where do we get the idea for human rights and human equality? You cannot cut open a human being and discover in their DNA human equality. It's not the sort of thing that Plato or Aristotle believed in. Of course, there are citizens and there are barbarians, and there are males and there are females, and there are slaves and there are free people, and we live within a hierarchy. And as Bart has already said about the paterfamilias, there is a person at the top of that hierarchy who is in this priestly role, who has incredible rights over the lives and bodies of everyone else, within that structure. And I guess I begin the book with equality because I want to go back to Genesis 1 and say on page 1 in the beginning, we've got male and female in God's image to have dominion over the world. And I think that's a radically different creation account to the ancient Near Eastern accounts, to the Greek and Roman myths, to the Egyptian myths, in which there are chaotic forces at play and humanity are made as slaves for the gods. And in Genesis 1, you've got humanity as having dominion. It's God's world, but he puts humans in charge. So you have this incredible dignity that is given to the human person. And one of the people I reference in the book is Celsus in the 2nd century, a great critic of Christianity, who talks about the radical error of Jews and Christians. And radical error number 1 is this Hebrew idea that God uniquely blesses humans. Why should that be the case? Mm-hmm. But that radical error is compounded by the Christians who come along and say, not only does God uniquely bless humans, God uniquely becomes human in the person of Jesus. And so you've got this foundation for humanism in God the human. And no wonder you can get the Apostle Paul coming along later in Galatians and saying there's no male, no female, slave, no free, Jew nor Gentile, because we're all one in Christ Jesus. Modeled within the church, you start to get this idea of a different kind of family in which everyone, no matter their station, is a brother or a sister, and no one is Lord except Christ. And obviously, it takes a long time, like yeast working through dough, like the mustard seed growing, until we get modern ideas of equality. But I think very specifically, these have come from biblical and particularly Christian foundations.
Glenn points to Genesis and early Christian teachings as the foundation of equality. But that doesn't hold up when we look at the facts. The Bible, both Old and New Testament, clearly supports slavery, patriarchal dominance, and the subordination of women. In Exodus 21, slave ownership is explicitly regulated, not condemned. In the New Testament, Paul tells slaves to obey their masters. He doesn't call for abolition. Women are told to remain silent and submit. This isn't hidden. It was used to justify inequality for centuries. Christian empires ran the transatlantic slave trade. The church opposed women's suffrage. Even the idea of consent in marriage wasn't accepted until secular law overrode religious norms. The real turning point came during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire, Paine, and Mary Wollstonecraft challenged religious authority and pushed ideas of freedom, equality, and universal rights, based on reason, not scripture. So no, modern human rights didn't come from Christianity. They emerged in spite of it, through centuries of struggle against the very hierarchies religion helped build. Let's hear what Bart has to say about that.
When you go back to the creation stories, I think the most troubling thing is not Genesis 1, but Genesis 2, when you have the detailed description. I assume you're talking about the equality of humans, because Genesis 1 is not about equality of living beings, because the whole point is humans have the entire creation to be subordinate to humans.
Dominion.
And so the question is, are men and women created equally? And I get your point from Genesis 1. When you have the account in Genesis 2 about how it actually happens, God first makes Adam and makes Adam a living being, and then Adam needs a helper, and so he creates all the animals, and these are to be his helpers. But it turns out there's no one suitable, so he makes a woman out of the man, an isha out of the ish in Hebrew, and she's to be his helper, his helpmate. That's why she exists. He does not come into being to help her. She comes into being to help him, and then she leads him astray. according to the biblical record. And this is the consistent motif throughout the Bible, is that women are to be subordinate to men. There are, it's massively evident when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And when in the New Testament, where you have somebody pick up this story from Genesis 2, it's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where the author, claiming to be Paul, says that women are not to talk in church. They're to exercise no authority over a man. They're to be subject to men, because Eve was misled, not Adam. And this is what happens when women teach. They get misled by the devil and they lead the man astray. You get a similar thing in Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 14 about women are not to talk in church. So it's true that Galatians does say that in Christ there's no male or female or slave or free, and that's absolutely true, and it's absolutely important that he says that. But the two key words are in Christ. What he means is that everybody equally gets salvation. But Paul does not think that they are equal in the church. He tells the women in Corinth that they are to be subject to their husbands, just as the husbands are subject to God. And so the husband is their God. And so this is not equality on any social level. And if you look at the history of Christianity, I don't think anyone would look at the history of Christianity through late antiquity or the Middle Ages into the Reformation and would think that Christianity supported equality for all human beings. They simply didn't. It's not until the Enlightenment that comes about. And the people who developed this in the Enlightenment were not always Christians. In fact, most of them weren't Christian in any sense that you would recognize. And so you have I would agree, you have kind of the roots there. You have the roots in also other forms of ancient thought, though. I don't know if you've looked into Stoicism, but in the Stoic world also you have various traces of this. And so the Enlightenment does have earlier traces, but I don't think it's an exclusively Christian concept, and I don't think it's a particularly Christian concept, because in fact Christianity supports subordination, not equality.
Okay. Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we might need the 7 hours. Okay. So the fact that Adam comes first within the Genesis narrative means that he is more primitive, because we go from very simple things in Genesis to much more complex things. And in terms of Adam, we go from dust to man to woman. And if Adam is the head of creation, Eve is the crown. And so I think if you just follow literarily what is going on in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't get the sense of Eve being a lesser, but actually a more developed creature than Adam is. And the fact that she is the helper, the Ezer, is that, God is most commonly spoken of as our help, in that we cannot live without him. We need help. We desperately need help. And so the helper does not mean it's a diminutive role at all, I would say. And then it's interesting where does the feminist impulse come from? And you have said that Galatians is very important in that. I would say the treatment of women by Christ was radically countercultural in the day. That the marriage and family program, as Joseph Henrich has put the sort of the early church sexual ethic of the day, was radically equalizing in terms of its expectations of men and women. I get into this in my consent chapter, that if the sexual revolution of the 1960s equalized the sexes by saying women can be as freed as men have always been sexually, the first century sexual revolution was basically men must be as restricted as women have always been. And in a sense, very, very few things I would say have ever been as liberating for women and children than that first century sexual revolution, in which men are utterly restricted to the levels of modesty and chastity that were always expected of women. And I'm not saying that in the first century we have a fully blown sense of the UN Declaration of Human Rights or of any of that, but I am saying that exclusively and particularly it is a Christian understanding that is developing. And then when you get into the idea of, did these ideas come from the Enlightenment? I tend to think that that's more a creationist narrative, that sort of out of nowhere has come these ideas of equality, without a backstory. And I would just encourage people to be more evolutionary in their thinking, in a theistic sense, that actually what was developed through the Enlightenment and on into the modern world were foundationally Christian views that I don't think you would get without those Christian foundations.
I mean, what do you just quickly say to the Bart saying the concept of equality was also floating around in Stoicism and other ancient forms of thought and philosophy? Perhaps it was just Christianity that kind of was the vehicle that really, took it forward eventually because of the triumph of Christianity. But do you think it was there otherwise, Glenn?
You can point to all sorts of things that we look back now through glasses and through a prism that can point out things in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures that we can applaud, including any traces of equality that we see in Stoicism. I guess my question would be, why are we looking for those particular things? And I would say that the reason we're looking for those particular things is we're coming from an irreducibly Christian mindset that is looking for those particular things.
So can I respond to some of that, Justin?
Please.
I mean, I don't think it's irreducibly Christian, because if you're going to do an evolutionary model, of course, Christianity came out of other things too. It's not really fair to isolate Christianity, for example, apart from Judaism. And so you could just as well write the book saying that it's not a Christian model, it's a Jewish model. So I think that the lens you're looking at as a Christian theologian is Christianity, but if you look at it historically, I don't think it works. When you look, and I don't think the Enlightenment came out of nowhere at all. I think there definitely were roots, and some of them were Christian, and some weren't. As to Adam and Eve, though, I've got to say I don't think the logic works. I love the idea that Eve is the pinnacle. That God saved the best for last. That's great. But if you follow that logic, what you're saying is, first God creates the other animals to help Adam. And if he's more primitive than Eve because he was first, that means he's more primitive than the animals, which means that spiders and snakes and aardvarks are superior to humans in that scheme.
The animals are already there. He just hadn't named them.
No, God made them in order to help him. That's why he made.
God brought the animals to him, but the animals are created.
The animals are created, at least in the first chapter of Genesis. The animals get created on whatever it is, day 4 or 5.
I'm not talking about the first. As you know, look, this is another long issue. But Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 come from two different stories. Eve does not show up in Genesis 1. Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2, and Glenn is presupposing Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, when he says that Eve came second. So I'm talking about what he's talking about, Eve coming second. She doesn't come second, she comes after the animals. And so if she's superior to Adam because she was made as his helper, the animals are made as his helpers.
They're not made. They were brought to him. They were brought to him. They weren't made. Okay.
No, I'm sorry. That God makes the animals in order to help Adam. He names them, but they're only after they're made.
Bart's completely right to highlight that Genesis 2 is deeply rooted in hierarchy, not equality. And the proof isn't just in the story, it's in how that story was used for centuries to justify male dominance and female subordination in Christian doctrine, law, and society. Take 1 Timothy 2:11-15, used for over 1,800 years to deny women leadership, silence them in church, and justify that their nature is more easily deceived. This wasn't fringe theology, it was mainstream. Influential figures like Augustine, Tertullian, and Aquinas all reinforced the idea that women were inferior by nature. Aquinas even wrote that women are defective and misbegotten men, a conclusion drawn straight from Christian interpretations of Genesis. The idea that Jesus introduced gender equality doesn't match the facts. There's no gospel record of Jesus calling for the end of patriarchy or slavery. He didn't challenge the legal inferiority of women, or say anything about women's rights to divorce, own property, or testify in court. Things women in Roman society were often denied. Glenn's claim that the early church equalized sexual expectations between men and women is misleading. The early Christian sexual ethic wasn't about freedom or fairness, it was about control, especially over women's bodies. Church fathers idealized virginity and celibacy, especially for women, and viewed sex even in marriage as suspect. Jerome, one of Christianity's most influential thinkers, said, "Nothing is so unclean as a woman's body." That's not a foundation of equality. That's institutional misogyny. And the idea that Christianity slowly evolved into modern human rights is revisionist. Real legal equality and consent laws didn't emerge from churches. They were won against the churches by secular thinkers during the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment didn't come out of nowhere, but its core principles, freedom of thought, bodily autonomy, equality before the law, often clashed with Christian orthodoxy. Thinkers like Spinoza, Hume, Voltaire, and Paine questioned divine authority and rooted human rights in reason and shared experience, not in divine revelation. That's where real equality began to take legal shape. Christian institutions resisted these ideas, sometimes violently. And even the idea of consent in marriage, the church didn't teach that marital rape was wrong until the late 20th century. In fact, marital rape was legal in most Christian countries until feminist, secular movements challenged the doctrine that wives owed sex to their husbands, a view grounded in centuries of Christian theology. So Glenn's idea that Christianity planted the seeds of equality just doesn't hold up. What history shows is that Christianity institutionalized hierarchy, and that human equality had to be wrestled out of its grip by people brave enough to question its authority.
Let's start with you here. Why do you believe that Christianity did give us that sense? And then we'll see what Bart has to say.
I think there is kindness and there's compassion in all sorts of pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures. So it's like I don't want to be heard to say that Christianity has a monopoly on kindness, on tender-heartedness, on love. But I think there is something unique about the highest becoming the lowest on the cross, in order that we, the lowest, might be brought into his hospitality. You know, if the way of all nature is the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest, the Christian story is the sacrifice of the fittest, Christ, so that we, the weakest, might survive. And I think whereas in the realm of nature it is tit for tat, in the realm of nature it is nature red in tooth and claw, there is something supernatural about the way of Christ. There's something against nature. There is something that says, I will protect the weakest. And obviously it was something that a critic of the church like Nietzsche hated. He saw the cross as the transvaluation of all values. Because, of course, nature teaches us that the weak, the low, and the botched should perish, and we shall help them to do so, he says in the Antichrist. And therefore, Christians have always, he thought, stood in the way of a proper humanitarian ideal. And the proper humanitarian ideal is we can all fly off to become Ubermensch. We can all fly off to greater heights of humanity if we let the poor, the weak, the low, and the botched, as he called them, perish so that we can, evolve to a higher degree. I think the revulsion that we feel at that sentiment is a particularly Christian revulsion. And it is born of some particularly Christian intuitions. I think we've been looking at a picture of the Lord on the cross for thousands of years, and we have held that up as our image of what it is to be great. And whoever will be greatest among you must serve, and the first shall be last, and all that kind of stuff that Jesus taught. I think we have been formed, whether we've been to church or not, all of us have been formed by an image of greatness in sacrifice, and even shameful sacrifice on the cross for the sake of the other, which I think gives a bite to a Christian understanding of compassion.
And how, just before we come back to Bart, was that, in your view, shown in practical ways by the early Christian church?
Hospitals, for instance, would be an interesting place to go. Now that the Greeks had their manuals of how Galen's 4 humors and how to be a physician and to help people, and the Romans had their sort of sick bays for the slaves and the soldiers, but that was to restore them to economic and military fruitfulness. The idea of hospitals for the weak and the poor and the sick who could not afford it, became a very much a Christian thing that happened, and there was a cascade of hospitals that sort of happened from the 4th century onwards. Would be one kind of thing, or standing against abortion and infanticide, and not simply standing against abortion and infanticide, but taking the exposed infants and raising them in orphan care and that sort of thing. That would be another way of actually standing against the way of nature.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Bart, that in those pagan cultures, it was legal, essentially, to abandon and expose, as it was called, infants who were unwanted economically, or because they were malformed or whatever it was. And as I understand it, Christians became to be known for people who would go to those places where they were traditionally left and took them in and adopted them and so on. For this is a part of a big picture that Glenn believes goes back to this idea of the God who was willing to be sacrificed and kind of upheld the poor and the lowly and so on over the powerful. What's your view on that as being the kind of the linchpin for where this central virtue of compassion as a value came from in Western culture?
I've got two things to say about it. One is this is the one area of Glenn's book that I completely agree with in most ways. I would put it differently. The way not contradictorily, just a different way. My different way of thinking about it is, I actually deal with this in this book that just came out with Yale about my journeys to the afterlife, because some of them deal with these issues and the issue is that in the Roman world generally, the ancient world generally, the world generally, the ideology was one of dominance. That whoever was dominant, there were no ethical problems with the person who was dominating somebody. That's what they were supposed to do. And so a powerful village there was no ethical problem with destroying the village next door, killing all the men and enslaving all the women. There wasn't an ethical problem with that. Or empires. And so you can read through the moral discourses of Romans and Greeks, and they don't problematize that. They don't problematize slavery. Of course, I mean, the master is supposed to be master of the slave, and so slavery is fine. Yeah, of course. They're usually prisoners of war in the ancient world. It wasn't a race thing. It's just, you enslave people. And men were to dominate women economically, socially, culturally, politically, sexually. And so it was all domination, and Jesus preached service. And it was completely contrary to what the dominant paradigm was that you're to serve others and to live for and to help the poor. And that's when, in the ancient world, if you had a lot of money and if you had to give some away or you did give some away, it was always to somebody on your same socioeconomic class, or to build a public building, or to put on a gladiatorial show or something like it was for your own, to promote your own status. The idea of helping the poor was like unheard of. It's like, are you kidding me? That's a joke. No, you're not going to help the poor. And so I completely agree with that is a paradigm shift. It's not the case that everybody accepted the paradigm. A lot of Christians were going around saying, yeah, Jesus said to sell everything. He didn't really mean it. And so, you get a lot of that. And people are people. But you do get the shift in how preachers preached it. The other thing I would say, though, is that it doesn't originate with Christianity. Jesus is pulling on the Old Testament prophets. It originates with Judaism. What Christianity did is it took over the world. And so this Jewish idea of love your neighbor as yourself became a dominant paradigm in the West, at least theoretically, because of Christianity. I agree with that. And it's true, you get hospitals and you get orphanages, and you get the weird idea that you're concerned about the destitute. Ancient pagans talk about it and they say, what? No, we're not doing that.
Bart makes two important points here, and they both stand up to history. First, the idea that caring for the poor and weak was some radical new Christian invention just isn't true. That moral shift began long before Jesus, in Judaism through prophets like Isaiah, Amos, and Micah, who condemned the rich for exploiting the poor and called on the people to care for widows, orphans, and the oppressed. Jesus was teaching in that tradition, not creating something new. Second, even when Christianity became dominant, it didn't consistently follow its own ideals. Yes, some Christians rescued infants, built hospitals, and preached compassion. But these were exceptions, not norms. For most of church history, the poor were still exploited, slavery was normalized, and church institutions amassed enormous wealth while preaching humility. Even monastic hospitals, which Glenn praises, were often limited to serving other Christians, sometimes only clergy, and could exclude the very people Jesus supposedly came to help. The compassion that survived did so because people, not institutions, fought to keep it alive. And let's not forget, many non-Christian cultures also built systems of care. In India, Buddhist monastic hospitals predate Christian ones. In China, Confucian ethics promoted caring for the vulnerable. The idea that only Christianity cared for the weak is not just inaccurate, it's dismissive of the full human story. Bart is right. Christianity spread a Jewish ethic, but it didn't originate it, and it often failed to practice it. The values we hold today, compassion, consent, equality, were won through a long, difficult evolution, often in spite of religion, not because of it. What do you think? Do you believe religion is necessary for morality, or can human values grow without it?
You made a statement a couple of months ago that I found very interesting. And I don't claim to understand it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. You said that you were a cultural Christian. Okay, and so that raised a number of questions in my mind. And the first question was,
You are changing the subject.
No, I'm not. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I may be leaping outside of the topic a bit to get back to it.
We can do cultural Christianity, but I think I have a list of questions that you wanted to ask, and that is one of them. But I think Professor Dawkins did ask you...
You were referring to the predictive power and to the utility of the stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to zero in on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean, I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing. I meant by that no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy.
Okay, a hierarchy that points to what?
Well, in the case of Islam, I dislike any religion which punishes apostasy with death, that throws gay people off high buildings, that practices clitoridectomy. That seems to me to place Islam on a lower level than Christianity, but that's not to say anything very positive about Christianity.
Well, it might be to say something positive about Christianity. Like, I think that question is open, because you might ask yourself, what did Christianity get right that led it away from those particular presumptions and towards something that you regard as more ethically appropriate? Like, this isn't a trivial question.
It's a very modest claim. There's not very much. I mean, to be better than a religion that throws gay people off high buildings is not really a very virtuous achievement.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true, because if you look at the barbarism that characterizes the human past, you might think that any progression whatsoever towards something approximating mercy and tolerance is nothing short of a bloody miracle.
Well,
like, people are pretty pretty ruthless, and so are our chimpanzee cousins.
Yes, they are.
Right. So,
yes.
So we move forward into the light with great difficulty,
yes,
and
yes.
the fact that we can take that for granted now, and that it seems self-evident and deserving of faint praise, it's not so clear to me that that's a reasonable proposition.
Okay, let's grant the faint praise, but that has nothing to do with the truth value, and what I care about is the truth value. I see no truth value in the claims of Christianity, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracles. Do you believe in any of those? Do you believe Jesus was born a virgin?
As I said before, there are elements of the text that I don't feel qualified to comment on. My experience has been that the more, I know from a metaphorical perspective and from a mythic perspective what the story of the virgin birth means, and I accept that. I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies. And I don't know how that needs to be expressed in a form.
Is it true, though?
Do you mean that you don't know?
Well,
Dawkins is making an evidence-based argument. Christianity as a belief system doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There's no empirical evidence for the virgin birth, resurrection, or miracles. None of these claims meet the standards of historical verification. For example, Bart Ehrman, a respected New Testament scholar, points out that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death by anonymous authors, full of contradictions and theological bias. That's not reliable evidence, it's religious tradition. When Peterson talks about holding the mother and child sacred, he shifts to metaphor. But metaphors don't prove anything. They might feel meaningful, but they're not evidence for a god, a virgin birth, or divinity. Dawkins stays focused on truth. Peterson avoids the question entirely. When Dawkins is asked something, he gives a clear answer. When Peterson is asked, he deflects. That's why Dawkins calls it out. Maybe Peterson doesn't actually believe these things and doesn't want to admit it. And the idea that Christianity led us toward mercy and tolerance? History doesn't support that. The Inquisition, witch trials, slavery justified by Scripture, and opposition to women's rights and science all came from dominant Christian cultures. Progress came in spite of religion, not because of it. Led by secular thinkers like Voltaire, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell, and modern human rights advocates. Dawkins is right to say, cultural familiarity doesn't mean truth, and religious comfort doesn't equal evidence. Let's continue watching.
Let me ask you about that, because truth, this is something I talked with Sam Harris about too. Truth, as we know, is a tricky business. Do you think there are differences in the truth claims between different writers of fiction? Like, is Dostoevsky more profound than...
Well, I wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway. I mean, these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound. Yes, there's something true about what he's writing about.
It's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with. The truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with whether one writer of fiction has a sort of insight into human nature. That goes without saying. I accept that.
Okay, so how do we deal with the notion that on the purely factual side, how do we deal with the idea, let's take you talked about clitoridectomy, let's talk about the oppression of women.
Yes.
We make a scientific case that that's inappropriate? Or is it a case that we're making on some other grounds? Like I see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of the earliest pronouncements is that both men and women carry the image of God, both. And that sets a certain tone to everything that follows. And it is a remarkable proclamation given its radical age, that both men and women carry the image of God and are to be treated as something with intrinsic value outside of the domain of power and politics. And it isn't obvious to me, having thought about this a lot, how we deal with that in the pure realm of fact. Because one of the facts is, if I can oppress you, why the hell shouldn't I?
Yeah, my job is to keep things on track here. I think there are a number of questions which Professor Dawkins has asked quite directly that we still haven't really heard an answer for.
Okay.
And Professor Dawkins asking about the virgin birth. You started talking about metaphor, you started talking about myth. I think anybody listening to this conversation will understand that maybe a society that doesn't believe in the virgin birth won't work. Maybe that's the predictive power that you're talking about. But I think you must understand that when Professor Dawkins is asking you, do you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? He means something like a biological fact. And by the way, saying I don't know, or saying, I'm not qualified to comment, is an answer to that question. But is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know how to, that I'm incapable of fully accounting for. I can't account for what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees and demolish the pagan enterprise. So there's some power in that story that's remarkable.
Let's stick to the virgin birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, the virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
Like these sorts of questions, what would you say? They don't strike me as, they're not getting to the point.
I know
the
that.
story
I know
has
you
a
think
purpose.
that. Yes.
Well, and look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that, and I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned, and it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story. And so that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery, and it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern. And there are patterns that seem to work and to propagate themselves properly and to orient cultures towards life abundant. And there are other patterns, the pattern of Cain, for example, that lead to absolute bloody devastation. And I don't know exactly how to construe that sort of truth. But we talked about the oppression of women, for example. It's like, how do you make a case on purely factual grounds that women should be treated as equals?
It's a moral question, and
I know that's exactly.
And I was dealing with a factual question, which is, did Jesus have a father? And you won't answer it.
Well, Jesus
it's a different
had an
kind of
earthly
question.
father and a heavenly father, like almost all mythological heroes.
So he wasn't born of a virgin, then. So you're saying that Jesus was not born of a virgin?
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact-value dichotomy in that case. I said the same thing about the resurrection.
It's not a value. It's a simple fact. I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question.
Dawkins asked a simple question. Was Jesus born of a virgin? Peterson danced around it for minutes without answering. That's exactly the problem Dawkins is pointing out. If the core claims of Christianity can't be answered as facts, they collapse under basic scrutiny. The virgin birth isn't just unverified, it's based on a mistranslation. The original Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 is Alma, which means young woman, not virgin. The Greek Septuagint mistranslated it as Parthenos, meaning virgin, and that error made its way into the Gospels. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and Geza Vermes confirm this. It's not controversial, it's academic consensus. Peterson tries to say these stories are powerful because they moved culture, but power doesn't prove truth. Islam, communism, and Nazi ideology also moved millions. That doesn't make them true. He also claims Christianity elevated women. But the Bible repeatedly treats women as property. Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 22, and even Paul's letters instruct women to submit. The real progress for women came through secular law, civil rights movements, and feminist philosophy, not scripture. And when Dawkins asks again, did Jesus have a human father? Peterson still won't say. That's why Dawkins is right. If the answers don't hold up when plainly asked, then the claims don't deserve to be treated as truth. Let's keep watching.
It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here, that even if you think that, say, the author of the biblical texts intended much more significance than a simple scientific analysis of events, Professor Dawkins is interested in scientific truth. That's the kind of truth that he's interested in. And even if you think it's irrelevant to the point of what the gospel authors were getting at, that first needs to be clarified before you can then begin actually uncovering what the stories are about. So I think Professor Dawkins is asking from a scientific perspective, and maybe you think that that scientific approach is wrong, but if you just take it for a moment, maybe this is how we find out that it is wrong. Let's take a scientific approach, ask the question, did this occur?
I think that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire, what would you say, deep mythological enterprise.
Well, suppose we weren't doing that. Suppose we were asking out of interest. Suppose that we were all here devout Christians, maybe even Jungian Christians, and we thought, this is interesting, over dinner. Do you think it really happened, like scientifically? Would your answer just be, I don't know?
Yes.
And you wouldn't consider it, I mean, it's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, we've heard everything that you're saying about metaphor and myth, but because the question is still then being asked, did it really happen? You know that that's what you're being asked. And the way you just so easily said yes, I wonder why you struggle to do that in so many other circumstances.
I think because I don't look at the situation the same. The way that Dr. Dawkins and I look at the situation are really quite different, and at many, many, many levels. You know, so even on the meme question, for example, you know, like, I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep. And we're dealing with things that we don't understand the relationship between metaphoric truth and value predicated truth and factual truth. We don't understand that. It's a big problem. There's no evidence whatsoever from the scientific perspective that we can orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of the facts.
Sure.
And that's a fact. And it's a fact that's been detailed out in great detail in the last 60 years by people from a variety of different disciplines. We have to prioritize the facts. That's a value hierarchy. There may be true and false ways of prioritizing facts, but you can't determine the truth or falsehood of the way that you prioritize facts by making reference to the facts. That's a big problem.
Okay, let's talk about that as perhaps a slight detour here, because I think we do need to come back to this Christ resurrection thing. But Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of the space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, but by the way, I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet. These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to 1 hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
Peterson keeps dodging a basic question. Did the virgin birth or resurrection happen as a fact? He talks about myth, metaphor, and the power of stories, but that's not the issue. Dawkins is asking for evidence, not symbolism. Peterson claims truth can't just be about facts, but that's not how we build reliable knowledge. Science is based on observation, testing, and replication, and it works. We can date the Earth to 4.54 billion years with radiometric dating. We can trace the evolution of life through fossils and DNA. and we can land probes on comets using quantum calculations accurate to fractions of a nanometer. That's truth we can build on. Compare that to the Bible. No evidence for a global flood, no external confirmation of the Exodus, and no verifiable proof of a virgin birth or resurrection. These aren't mysteries. They're claims made without evidence. Peterson wants to treat myth as equal to science, but stories are not substitutes for facts. And when Peterson says Dawkins doesn't understand religious literature, that doesn't change the problem. Truth claims require evidence, not familiarity with ancient texts. Dawkins is right. Prioritizing facts over comforting myths is how we make progress. What do you think? Should society lean on ancient stories, or should we demand truth backed by real evidence? Like the video, subscribe for more sharp commentary, and let's keep thinking critically, together.